Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome. First of all, I just want to say welcome to everyone for being here for this very important conversation today. This webinar is not just a survivor, the role of lived experience experts in the role of policy, and it's such an incredibly important conversation. This is part of our Freedom Requires Action webinar series hosted by the Safe House Project, really focused on where do we need to go with policy? What are the changes that need to be made to be more effective in the fight against human trafficking? And if I can be quite honest, I don't think any of the other conversations are as important as the one that we're going to have today. So often we hear that survivors need a place at the table, but I think when it comes to actually walking the walk, if you will, right? Putting our money where our mouth is, I think is one of the old sayings. I think we're falling a little short. And I think that it's an opportunity for us to be more proactive in this space and see some of the leadership. I'm so excited about the three panelists that we have today with us to be able to really demonstrate what leadership looks like in this space and what our federal government is doing to try to fill the space. I did want to take a moment just to acknowledge a very dear friend of mine, Barbara Amaya, survivor of trafficking, who unfortunately passed away this year. Today is actually her birthday, and there's a memorial for her this evening. But Barbara used to say all the time, nothing about us without us. And I think that is such an incredible theme because survivors need, I've had the privilege of working in many different roles throughout my career within the human trafficking space, but I can never provide the perspective of a lived experience expert. I cannot give that perspective when sitting around the table. And so to that point, nobody is here to listen to me talk. We are here to listen to our incredible panelists that are here. And I'm so honored to first introduce Director Chris Rose from the Office for Victims of Crime at the U.S. Department of Justice. Chris Rose is the director, where she oversees programs and services that support crime victims and survivors. She was appointed the position by President Biden and sworn in on July 12th, 2021. And at OVC, she oversees nearly $9 billion in grant funding to provide vital compensation and assistance to persons impacted by crime. OVC also invests in new and innovative approaches to improving the criminal justice and community response to crime victimization and raises awareness of crime victim rights. Prior to her OVC appointment, she was selected to serve on the Department of Defense Independent Review Commission on Sexual Assault in the Military, where she led the victim care and support line of effort. She spent nearly 20 years at DOJ serving in numerous roles, including Deputy Director at OVC, as Acting Director, and Deputy Director for the National Institute of Justice, and is the Chief of Staff for the Office of Violence Against Women. In 2016, she had the distinct privilege of working at the White House on detail as a senior policy advisor on violence against women in the office of Vice President Joe Biden. And as senior policy advisor, she provided expert advice and guidance on domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. In 2013, Ms. Rose spent 8 months as a victim advocate in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., working hands-on with victims of all violent crime. She has had just an incredible career from a programmatic perspective, a hands-on in the field perspective. She served as Director of Strategic Partnerships for Healing Justice and is the Executive Director for the End Violence Against Women International. We're so honored to have you here with us, Director Rose, and to hear about all the incredible work that OVC is really doing in this space. Most people don't know, but OVC funds is the predominant funder of victim service programs for survivors of human trafficking. And so, Director Rose, I was wondering if you could share with us exactly what does OVC, what is OVC for those that may not be familiar with it? What's its primary purpose? And talk a little about the key functions it performs in supporting victims of crime.
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to. And thank you, Bill. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here with everyone and to join these talented women on this panel. For those of you who may not be familiar, OVC is part of the Justice Department, and it's located within the Office of Justice Programs. And every year we award millions of dollars from the Crime Victims Fund to support victim compensation and assistance in just about, well, all states and about 5 territories. We also have some discretionary funding that we can use to fund new and innovative programs to expand access and support for crime victims. But for the purposes of this webinar, we are also the largest funder of federal dollars directed at combating human trafficking and serving survivors of trafficking in the US. And we provide support for both adult and minor survivors of sex and labor trafficking. And in everything we do, we strive to ensure that all survivors have access to rights, options, and services that are not only culturally responsive, but are victim-centered and trauma-informed. And to give you a sense of how busy we are, our team, our human trafficking division, oversees nearly 400 active anti-trafficking grant awards, and that represents over $300 million in federal funding. And the programs support direct services such as case management, education, employment, health, housing, legal assistance, but also multidisciplinary collaboration and state level approaches to both identifying and serving child and youth victims of trafficking, as well as training and technical assistance. And I think that OVC has a really unique role in the Department of Justice because we do focus on crime victims' rights and services, but that we also work to elevate survivors' perspectives in a system that doesn't always do the best job of that. Survivor engagement is an issue that I am passionate about, and I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to amplify our work here today.
Thank you. Yeah, I know that's exactly right. Oftentimes we think of our justice system as holding offenders accountable, which is important. But, so often, the survivors, those that have been victimized by those offenders, are not provided with the support. And so your office is just doing an incredible job to try to do that, not just through funding, but through some really innovative programs. And you do have such an amazing team there that I know works very hard day in and day out to be
And I know
tied in
you
with.
know who they are too. Yeah.
Yes. So, well, thank you. And then we also have Keelan Washington with us, who's a prominent figure in the fight against human sex trafficking, renowned for her expertise, advocacy, and public speaking. Her personal journey as a survivor has fueled her commitment to making a difference. Keelan's dynamic public speaking engagements have been instrumental in raising awareness and mobilizing support, and her influence extends to law enforcement, industry leaders, churches, and higher education institutions. Her impact is not limited to live audiences. Keelan has shared her story and expertise in documentaries like It's Happening Right Here and The War on Children. Additionally, she's contributed to the award-winning The Washington Times podcast. Keelan's journey from survivor to advocate has made her a powerful force in the fight against human trafficking, and her unwavering dedication, personal experience, and dynamic communication have had a profound impact, shaping the discourse and actions taken to combat this critical issue. Keelan, it's such a pleasure to have you here for your leadership in this space, that you continue to share all that you have been able to experience. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your personal journey as a survivor leader and how that's influenced programs and initiatives, particularly the ones that you've developed to generate hope.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. It's really a great honor to stand in this space and to be able to share just my own experience, because I think what was interesting when I got out of the life of exploitation, there wasn't a lot of programming available. There wasn't a lot of safe houses. There weren't policies that supported survivors and kept them safe. And so when I jumped into the anti-trafficking movement and started my work with Generate Hope, one of the things that was so important to me was, what are those elements that I wish I had when I got out of the life of exploitation? And then how do we develop programs where we're able then to provide that to other survivors? And so in my role at Generate Hope, I oversee the day-to-day operations. What's been so important to me is that with our organization, not only are we survivor focused, but we're survivor led. The owner of the organization Generate Hope is Susan Muncie, who is a survivor herself, who decided to start this nonprofit over 15 years ago. And so what we believe is, how then do we put survivors in places of leadership to create change? And so one of the programs that I've developed and partnered with at Generate Hope is a survivor support group. There's a lot of support groups for a lot of different areas as far as substance abuse and mental health. But when it comes to a space for survivors, it's a very unique space that I feel like sometimes only survivors can sit in. And so, what I do through this support group is really meeting our clients where they're at. What are the real issues that they want to overcome? And what are the things that they want to learn? Because I also feel like there is a lot of space that, even in programming, sometimes we don't have some of the basic conversations about, what does it look like to build relationships with other women when you've been pit against each other in the life of trafficking? How do you have healthy relationships with somebody of the opposite sex? How do we regain trust? And so one of those elements is just sitting with them in the day to day to say, we're going to build these things out. A lot of programs I'm so thankful for, we can offer mental health support and sobriety support and legal support. But how do we build that foundation that when they do leave programs like ours, that they're living life successfully and they never have to go back to another program? And so I'm thankful that when I came into the movement of the anti-trafficking movement, that there were already survivor leaders in place. And with this, why it's so valuable is because when I got out, I didn't understand that there was a whole community of people that were doing this work. And so when I got in and I seen that there was another survivor who was speaking at conferences, who was developing programs, that is the one thing that helped me understand that I too can become that person. And so it's been important for us as survivor leaders in these roles that we're creating spaces for other survivors to come up and know that these opportunities are available to them, and they have a community of people that are willing to support them through this process. And not just female survivors. I think a lot of times we don't talk about the male survivors as well. And so that's been important in bringing awareness of, how do we change societal norms for men to come up and share their vulnerabilities and know that there's programs that are willing to support them as well. And so those are just some of the initiatives that we have at Generate Hope that I've been willing and able to really stand into and develop programs that are really going to help survivors overcome and have successful opportunity at life.
That's amazing. And I think, one of the things that kind of struck me as you were speaking, we are starting to talk more about programs for economic empowerment, right? For survivors as they transition from different programs. But I'm also thinking we need more programs on leadership development, right? That is something that's very natural in the workplace. I had those opportunities in my career. I know others have. And thinking about, as we create those economic opportunities, also creating leadership training, because that's a skill that can be taught, and I think that's something that we should bring into this conversation to allow those with lived experience to engage more effectively within this space. So I really appreciate you talking about that and the work that you're doing at Generate Hope. Next is Maria Contreras. Maria is a lived experience expert who thrives by serving her community through raising awareness about the needs of youth experiencing commercial sexual exploitation. She's a mother to 2 children whom she adores. She's also the Senior Community Policy Associate for the Collaborative Responses to Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children initiative at the National Center for Youth Law. In this role, Maria aims to ensure that state policy and practice to identify and serve youth impacted by commercial sexual exploitation are driven, excuse me, are driven by community and lived experience expertise. Prior to joining the National Center for Youth Law, she worked as a youth advocate at West Coast Children's Clinic, which is an amazing group. They've created a pretty cool tool that's being used all across the country, the See It tool. And she's obtained her BA in political, legal, and economic analysis and ethnic studies, and a master's in public policy from Mills College. So, Maria, we're so thankful for you being here with us today. I love that you are working on policy, but I wonder if you could share a little bit more about the National Center for Youth Law, what exactly they do, and how your lived experience as a survivor has really shaped your approach to policy advocacy and community engagement.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all. And can definitely share more about nickel, as we lovingly call it, because as you can hear, it's a mouthful. But basically, the National Center for Youth Law has been around for over 50 years, and we do a variety of different things related to children and family well-being. We have a team that's focused on immigration, and they're really leading the work with like the Flores case federally. We have a team that's dealing with child welfare. Of course, our team deals with sex trafficking and a variety of different things. And as you can imagine, all of these different things intersect in one way or another. And so we also collaborate in a variety of different ways to make sure that young people and families are getting what they need. And so specifically our team has been around for over a decade, a team that, has been led by the director, Kate Walker Brown, who Keelan also knows because she helps me lead the CSEC Action Team Advisory Board. But really, she was part of the group that prompted California to really pay attention to this issue of CSEC and what started this work, and really what started California's focus in funding, making sure that everything and anything that has to do with sex trafficking around the state and beyond is informed by people with lived experience. And so really, I think like in my bio, it says it pretty well. Like, I think, I have the privilege of having numerous experiences, including, having a master's degree and having experience what it means to provide direct service to young people. And yet those things still did not prepare me or give me the intuition that I needed to do the work that I do, that my lived experience did. And so I think that's where I think all of my different experiences meet, is that they're all useful. And even without my degrees and my other experiences, my lived experience just supersedes all of those. And so I think like one of the things that's difficult, of course, about creating policy is that it's really difficult to create a policy that addresses the needs of all people. And of course, people even within sex trafficking communities, we're not the same. We have a collection of different experiences and vulnerabilities. And so that's why it's so important to just have as many voices in the room. And unfortunately, as you mentioned earlier, oftentimes we get maybe one or two people, and that's even, not nearly as enough. People really need to be at the forefront in leading the actual policies. And so I feel like I'm on a mission to ensure that every single policy that impacts youth in particular is informed by the people with lived experience. Because as we know, like sex trafficking and all forms of trafficking don't happen in a vacuum. They really, dependent on the environment and the vulnerabilities that make young people vulnerable to these things. And not to discount adult survivors or people who experience trafficking as adults at all, but we know that a lot of the adult survivors or who continue to be trafficked as survivors experience that as when they were children as well. And so really focused on that, while also leaning in to my other experiences to inform the work that I do.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, it's I think just, you're absolutely correct. And that is that, not arguably probably not, there's no two stories that are the same, right? And so there's so many different experiences. And so making sure that we have that diversity of opinion, diversity of experience at the table, I think is so incredibly important. Director Rose, I want to just kind of side shift for somebody had asked in the chat, how do they stay in touch with you? So I just wanted to highlight before I forget, everyone can go to ovc.gov. And I would encourage everyone to do that, to learn about the work that OVC is doing, but also to sign up for their newsletter. One of the things that, if I can just brag on you for a second, Director Rose, that you do is the second Thursday of every month, you do a series called From the Director's Desk, where people can dial in and get updates on what OVC is doing. So for those that want to stay in touch with OVC, would highly encourage you to do that. I think that's just such an awesome opportunity that you offer to folks. But kind of getting, oh, go ahead. Sorry. Did you want to comment on that?
No, I was just thanking you for saying that. That's nice.
Yes. So, but getting back to kind of the topic at hand, could you talk a little bit about how OVC supports survivor-led initiatives and why is it so important to include the voices of those with lived experience in policymaking and advocacy efforts?
Sure. Well, I don't think it's not a coincidence that so many of the successful community organizations that are led or founded by a survivor, it was their lived experience that brought them to that place. And I think you've heard some of that today. We recognize that the only way that our programs and policies are going to be effective is if we listen and learn from those with lived experience, because that's who our programs are designed to serve. And unfortunately, what I have noticed, and I'm sure many folks listening and watching this webinar know, that crime survivors are rarely included in those conversations. And that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because people with lived experience add such depth and authenticity to those discussions. And we were reading a book in the OVC book club called Truth and Repair: How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice. And Dr. Judith Herman, the author, wrote that survivors of violence know in their bones the truths that many others would prefer not to know. And that is one of my favorite quotes from that book, because I think what it says is that people who have had the lived experience are going to tell you what it's really like and what will and will not work, right? They can often see with clarity what a justice system needs to be more responsive to crime victims. And I see it as our responsibility in the federal government to create an environment where survivors have confidence that they'll be heard and believed and supported. The Human Trafficking Division at OVC has worked so hard to incorporate survivor voices into its program, using listening sessions, input on agency products, and through training and technical assistance. For some time, OVC has actually required the applicants for training and technical assistance grants to demonstrate that they include the insight and the experience of survivors. And because of this, it's resulted in training for our grantees that can help them implement a survivor-informed approach and incorporate survivor feedback into their work. I'll give you some examples. It's called Project Trust Human Trafficking Outreach Kit, and that is designed to help grantees who work with lived experience experts avoid causing re-traumatization in those engagements. Another fantastic resource for the entire field is our Child Victims and Witnesses support materials. And those are specifically designed for children of different age groups to assist them in understanding the justice system, whether they are coming to that system as a victim or as a witness to crime. And we have a set of graphic novels specifically developed for youth trafficking survivors. And they were developed using survivor and youth input. And in fact, when they were recording the audio versions of the materials, the grantee that was producing them hired young survivors to consult and participate in their development. And all of these resources can be accessed through links on OVC's website. I want to mention that in FY22, OVC made $1 million award to the Survivor Alliance and ICF Survivor-led team to implement what's called the Survivor Engagement Training and Technical Assistance Project, and we call it SETA for short. And SETA's goal is to promote effective survivor engagement among OVC's anti-trafficking grantees. So the survivor-led team at SETA, they work with our OVC grantees to develop meaningful collaborations with lived experience experts. And just one last thing, OVC added new language in all of our anti-trafficking funding opportunities that encourages applicants to propose and implement intentional, sustainable engagement from individuals with lived experience so that they can enhance the programming that they are going to be doing.
I just have to say, like, I just love how OVC is thinking outside of the box, and yeah, I think if I can be so bold to say sometimes we get frustrated with government because it seems to move so slow, and but really we've seen such incredible success when we start to think outside of the box and some of these really innovative programs through the amazing leadership of your human trafficking team at OVC. So just really encouraged to see that and setting the standard, setting that pace for the rest of the field to start thinking, doing that forward thinking that we so often kind of dream about, right? So, Keelan, I wanted to ask you some of the key strategies that you employ. So we've heard some of the really innovative programming that OVC is working on. What are some of the strategies that you're employing within Generate Hope to support the holistic recovery of trafficking survivors to be able to move into some of these leadership roles?
Yeah. So what was really important for us is to really look at what are the things that prevent survivors from really getting the opportunity to fully heal from their trauma. One of the things, like, I'm here in San Diego, which means rent is through the roof. Everything is super expensive here. So if we do have a survivor that has just come out of her trafficking situation, it becomes a barrier for her to be able to live on her own independently while she's still struggling to heal from some of her experiences. And so within our program is a 2.5-year program, and it's at no cost to the survivor. What we also looked at was, what are the other dynamics that they may have struggled with? And so a lot of that is their mental health, where we do support them and have therapists who come and run therapeutic groups for them, meet with them one-on-one. We also have an education and career support specialist, because what we know with survivors as they come into our program is that through their trafficking experience, a lot of them have lost the ability to dream about what the possibilities of their future could look like. What are their goals? What do they want to achieve? And so we are very specific about sitting in that space and opening the door to say, look, the possibilities are endless. How do we help you reach that space? And so we've had survivors who have come through our program who have got full ride scholarships, got their degrees, have been able to get their dream jobs that they've always wanted. And that process takes time. This is why our program is a 2.5-year program. And to be honest, sometimes that's not enough, depending on the length of time that their trauma and they've experienced trafficking. And so that's a portion of it. But the other portion is, a lot of times we have survivors who come in, and a part of their healing journey is to be able to press charges against their trafficker. And so we partner with pro bono attorneys and lawyers who do start that process. And one of the things that I really get excited about is being able to take that journey with the survivor, because it's a really difficult journey for them to take. They're opening a lot of their trauma and having the courage then to sit in a space in front of their trafficker to share their truth and hope that the justice system does their job. And so we've been fortunate to be able to stand in those spaces with survivors. The other component to this, as well, is, like, while we are providing a lot of resources for survivors, what's also been important to us, and sometimes we don't pay enough attention to, is the service providers. The people who are actually sitting in the spaces, giving space for survivors, offering the services, because it's not always an easy job. And so a part of that, and what I love to do with our staff at Generate Hope, is to be able to provide a lot of different types of trainings for them as well, because we know trafficking is so complex, right? We take one type of trafficking, but then there's familial trafficking, and then there's SRA. And every survivor is so different, but how do we look at a holistic approach to really meet the survivors exactly where they're at, and not try to put them in this cookie cutter box of all of this should work for you, and that doesn't work. And so we tailor our services to saying, where are you at and how do we help you get to that? So we do a lot of support with the staff in education, but also just looking at survivors as individuals. All survivors are vastly different. We all come with our unique set of skills and expertise, and it looks very different for every one of them. And so another part of that is, with some programming, once they leave the program, the support and services tend to end. And sometimes with the lack of community, we do see that they end up struggling, either going back to the life, or they have to go back to another program and start that all over again. And so what's been so important for us is that once they start their journey with us, we are honored and blessed to continue that journey with them for as long as they want us in that space. And so when we say doing life with survivors and meeting people where they're at, it's not just for a certain amount of time. So we want to continue to develop mentorship for them, even when they exit our program as well.
That's amazing. And I love that you bring that to bear, that, not every survivor is the same. Not every, you can't just create a program in a box, so to speak, right? Like that just doesn't work. And that's human nature. But I think sometimes we have a tendency to kind of paint with a broad brush or try to apply a label, and it just doesn't work. So we have to provide those unique opportunities. And to kind of tease out again what you say, I'm just stealing your words at this point, but really finding the skill set, right, that survivor brings to the table, and then giving an opportunity for them to really flourish within that space, right? Nurturing that skill set. And that's in any field, right? That's in any workforce. That is what leaders are called to do in their different positions. So thank you for highlighting that. I think that's so incredibly important. Um, Maria, kind of thinking about, you're working in policy, and you were very rightly so passionate about your role and what you're doing to make sure that you're reviewing and having a voice in any sort of policy or legislative change affecting children, and particularly the commercial sexual exploitation of children. Could you maybe highlight some of the most significant policy changes that you've seen, particularly ones that where you feel like a survivor-led voice or a survivor-led initiative really kind of moved the needle in getting that change across the line, or stopping something bad from happening too, right? That we know is a reality.
Yeah, I mean, policy is very complex, and oftentimes I feel like there's like this pull, this tension, people trying to do opposite things sometimes. But before I answer, I also just want to say, like, as a former direct service provider, like everything Keelan is sharing just makes me so happy. Because I left the direct service because it's very difficult work. And I just want to also say, like, direct service providers do not get paid enough to do that very difficult work. And so thank you for everything that you're doing. And I also love, what you mentioned about just like, tailoring services to each individual survivor, because just like that, justice looks also different for different survivors. And I think that leads into this conversation about policy, right? Because some people may want to pursue legal action and some of us may not. I was one of those people that did not, for a variety of different reasons, including that, like, my trafficker was my parent, right? And so there's different dynamics there and complications. And so back to your question, Bill, I think there's been several things that have gone well. Like, I think there's been greater attention in holding people accountable for harming folks rather than the other way around. I think that, like, oftentimes, and this makes me a little sad, is that we're, as survivors, asked to give empathy to the people that hurt us rather than greater attention to the people that are doing the hurting. And so, we've had that. We're having more conversations on holding, people who demand sex, which is also, I think, going in the right direction. There's also, our office worked on AB 124, which allows judges to use affirmative defense when a person is convicted of a crime whose crime, it was a direct result from their trafficking, because as we know, like, oftentimes those of us who are being trafficked are also forced to do other criminalized activities. And so we want to make sure that the criminal legal system understands those complexities and the reasons and the drivers and push factors of what leads a person to do what they do in different circumstances. And I think, like, and specifically, outside of legislative policy, because oftentimes we focus on legislative policy, so laws, but laws are also not the whole of policy, right? Laws are only as good as, the enforcement and the resources behind it. I also just want to flag that, again, I staff and support an advisory board of 10 adult survivors, people with lived expertise in California who do incredible work and lead policy and practice changes all over the state of California. And so some of the things that are happening that are very exciting here is that they're working hand in hand with the California Department of Social Services to create trauma-informed language trainings that are going to have a huge impact on the way that we talk to and talk about young people experiencing commercial sexual exploitation. We're redefining and really fine-tuning what being a young person at risk of exploitation means in order to make sure that the services and the resources are getting to the right young people. And we're also working really hard on continuing to implement harm reduction practices at all levels to make sure that young people are treated in the way that they need to be treated when they experience trafficking. And the list really goes on. And I'm sure that, Keelan can also talk about some of the exciting things that she has been involved with. But I think those are some of the both laws and non-law policy and practice things that are happening that are very exciting to me.
Amazing. It's amazing work. So, well, Director Rose, kind of thinking, we have two experts that are working in the NGO space. You mentioned earlier, some of the ways that OVC is engaging, particularly listening sessions and other ways. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, sharing some examples of successful collaborations between OVC, NGOs, policymakers, lived experience advocates that's really led to some significant policy changes or driven, if that's the right word, some of the ways that OVC is doing some of their work.
Sure. Well, the one prominent example is OVC's ongoing engagement with the U.S. Advisory Council. And the council provides a platform for presidentially appointed human trafficking survivors to advise and make recommendations on federal anti-trafficking policy to what's called the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. It's a lot. But we regularly consult with them. And in fact, the decision to include language encouraging grant applicants to obtain input from individuals with lived experience came from them. And one of our most important efforts underway is our collaborative work with the Department of Health and Human Services, their Office on Trafficking in Persons, to develop the standards of care for anti-trafficking service providers. And the decision to do this was a direct result of input from the field, both from service providers and from survivors, letting us know that there was a need for federal coordination on uniform service standards to ensure a consistent quality of care, and also to reduce the potential harm that can happen when you don't have that. And that grant we awarded to Freedom Network, and they are working closely with OVC and OTIP and a diverse group of stakeholders and individuals with lived experience to develop the standards. And it's something that, is a very high priority for OVC. It's something we're super excited about. Also, the network established a technical working group that is diverse in terms of perspectives and identities, including those from underserved communities, communities of color, faith-based communities, American Indian and Alaska Native, LGBTQ+, people with disabilities. And that as the work has unfolded, it's been very impressive to see the team's intentional efforts to get meaningful input from survivors. So in addition to the participation of survivors on the technical working group, next month we're going to be conducting a series of small, targeted listening sessions with individuals with lived experience, and that will include the U.S. Advisory Council.
Amazing. Yeah, it's so great to see, the federal government, and I say this respectfully, but, sometimes in DC, and I'm guilty of this as well, we kind of get stuck in our little bubble of Washington, D.C., which is sometimes disconnected from reality. And it's so great to be able to plug back in with the real world and be able to hear from those in the field doing the work. So that's amazing that you all are doing that. Keelan, you're out in the community a lot. You're out, really carrying that message forward, doing the work. Can you talk a little bit about how some of that advocacy, some of those public speaking engagements have really contributed to policy change or increased awareness on human trafficking?
Yeah, absolutely. Something that's always said is that prevention always starts with education, right? When I think back to my own experience of being trafficked as a minor, one of the things I come to the conclusion of is if my community, if my family, if the educational system and myself understood what trafficking was, I may not have been trafficked. And so knowing that a lot of the time the people who are being targeted for trafficking are usually under the age of 18. And so my advocacy work and public speaking really started in the high schools and middle schools. How do we reach the most vulnerable population and give them the tools and the education to understand what trafficking is so they are aware? That next step was how do we educate the parents, the service providers, the guardians who are in those spaces with the youth? How do we educate them? Because they're going to be the people who are training the youth up and having those really difficult conversations. They're the eyes and the ears with the kids, especially when COVID happened. We just tended to put all our kids behind a screen, and we've seen that trafficking went through the roof because now perpetrators, all they had to do was send mass DMs to kids. And then there we go, our youth are being trafficked at an extremely higher rate. And so one of the things that's always been near and dear to my heart is to work with the youth. I have a 17-year-old daughter, so I made it my personal business to understand what does social media look like. And I know a lot of us aren't versed in the gaming industry of like Fortnite and Roblox, but I made it my obligation to understand what that meant because there's so many open platforms that that perpetrators are standing in the space and having access to our children. And so that was one way that I do support our youth. The other portion of that is really standing in spaces of how does trafficking actually impact people and who is responsible for that? Because a lot of the time survivors are coming and they're getting out of the life and they're having many interactions with different people. And so regardless if it's service providers, how do we train them up to understand the signs of trafficking and support survivors when they're in their care? I work with law enforcement and the human trafficking task force to say, how do we create safe spaces where survivors feel comfortable disclosing that they've been trafficked and know that they're actually going to be able to receive services? And so what are the law enforcement's policy? Right? How do they interact? I mean, for a long time before, the last 20 years, it's to treat them as criminals. And we've done such a great job in the last 20 years to say, like, no, they're victims. They're humans. They didn't choose this life. And that started with us being able to have a conversation and open the narrative and an open discussion of what trafficking actually was. It's not prostitution. Prostitution implicates a choice. No, these are people who didn't choose this life. And the other part to that is, what about the people who are actually purchasing children? Right? Because I think a lot of the times we focus on the survivors, but what about the buyers aspect of that? And so I work with the city attorney's office, and I get to partner with them each quarter to provide a panel that we get to meet buyers exactly where they're at and create education for them as well. How do we have an open conversation with the people who are actually purchasing people? Because I'm a firm believer that shaming and guilting people doesn't produce change. But if we bring awareness of what is the actual impact and harm of the actual purchase of another individual, and how do they contribute to that? How do we increase laws that hold them accountable? But even in that aspect, I feel like sometimes just throwing people in jail isn't rehabilitation. We didn't teach them the skills. We didn't teach them anything different. So when they get out, they continue the same thing. So how do we sit in the spaces and look at trafficking from a holistic approach and then be able to step in every aspect of that? And so that's just been something that's near to dear on my heart. So my public speaking and advocacy is all the way from youth to law enforcement to buyers, perpetrators of all kinds, and partnering with other survivors as well, because it's not just a one person issue, it's a holistic approach that all needs to be addressed.
Yeah, the educate you're so spot on with the education. It's so incredibly important. Just recently had the privilege and honor to walk alongside a survivor who was going through the civil process, right, in court, but it was a jury, and unfortunately, it was not a successful outcome for the survivor, and a lot of that is because our jury pools are not understanding, where the individuals that are making those decisions don't understand trafficking. And so it's really unfortunate. And I think, in that regard, justice is not served. And so definitely doing more to advocate on that. Maria, I wanted to come to you quickly and just ask you to discuss some of the challenges and can't talk challenges and successes that you've encountered in ensuring that state policies and practices are driven by community and lived experience experts. Because I feel like sometimes our federal government's doing a good job, but maybe our states are falling a little short in that regard.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one of the things, and I love, like, there's a focus in like prevention and specifically on like educating young people in schools and stuff, which again, super powerful, super important. And also, we also have to look at it a little different in that it's not children's responsibility to keep themselves safe. It's adults' responsibility to not harm children. And so, like, where is the approach, the public health approach in preventing the harm from happening and really focusing on the people that are doing the harm, sort of in the way that Keelan is describing. I think one of the things that's been really challenging, even in this position where I get to be in very powerful spaces, I get to be with legislators, I get to staff the board and like convene a group of stakeholders from around the state and talk to them about priorities and services and all of that stuff. And it is still a challenge to get other
Mhm.
people, survivors in the room. And that just should not be what's happening. Like, part of my priority is to get as many people with lived experience in front of others, and also for others to do the preparing for them to be able to talk and be in their authentic selves in whatever, point in their healing journey they are, because we can't wait for someone to be, quote unquote, polished in order to be listened to. Like, people should be prepared to listen to the survivor who just got out but has a lot to say and to share about the state of how this person got into trafficking right
Mhm.
now, right? And so, like, figuring out how to do that and disrupt some of the cycles of not being inclusive of a variety of different ways of being in policy space. I also think that oftentimes when we are creating policy, and I've been guilty of this, like, I talk to the people who agree with me, who say, like, yeah, we should do this, this is the right approach. And like, even when we're in disagreement, we need to hear out the people who are not in agreement with us, because then we get an opportunity to address those things and to make our policy stronger, or to fight back if we really believe that that's not the right approach. I think, like, one of the things that, it's like different states are having different conversations. In California kind of pops in and out, but that conversation about like potential full decriminalization of the sex trade, like, and I'm just going to come out and say it, like, I don't like that idea. I think
Mhm.
that's not a great idea, but oftentimes, like, I have to fight to get in those spaces to provide that perspective, because they only invite people who are fully pro, full decriminalization of the sex trade, which is a problem. We need to be able to be more inclusive of folks that have different perspectives. But I also see things changing. Like, I have the privilege of, standing in the work of other survivors who made it a possibility for me to do this work and for others to do this work, like Keelan and like other elders that I've had the privilege of working with. Not that you're an elder, Keelan, but I know you've been doing this for a very long time, longer than I have. And so I don't take that lightly. Like, I want to create as much access for others as I can, because I know that I have the privilege to be in this space, and I want others to have that opportunity as well. And also young people. Oftentimes we don't talk to our youth, and that also needs to change, because they know how they experience the world in real time. Especially because, like, I'm gonna be 30 next year. That's not super old. And yeah, like, I did not experience trafficking online. That's a completely different thing. Like, we need to be more intentional about talking to our youth and how they're being groomed and their vulnerabilities.
Well, I just want to say the field is so lucky to have you fighting so ferociously to make sure that you're involved in those conversations and that your opinion, your voice is being heard because that is so incredibly important. I know we're out of time. I do want to just very quickly pose one final question to our amazing panel today, just to kind of round things out, a little bit of a curveball, if you will. If you had a magic wand, right? You could just wave your wand today based on this conversation. What would be the one thing that you would change or improve in the anti-trafficking field to ensure that survivors are empowered, supported, and engaged in policy and practice? So Maria, I'm going to actually start with you if that's okay. If you could wave that wand today, what's the one thing that you would wish for?
Unlimited resources. I think that like healing is just such an intensive process that like you cannot survive and also heal at the same time without it taking decades. Like I'm still in that process. And if we really want people to like be in their healing and be in this movement as survivors, like we need to pour in as much resources as we can. Like, and that includes like rental assistance and food and education, regardless of income for a number of years so that that person can afford to actually heal.
Amazing. Keelan.
This is such a good and deep question. I'm like, I have so many answers. I'm like, I'm just going to be waving my wand around all the time. I would say that we see survivors through a lens of strength. A lot of times we see survivors as less than or broken and not understanding what it actually takes for a survivor to actually survive their trauma to get to the point that they've chose to heal. And seeing survivors in that perspective, I think we start to interact with survivors in a completely different way, because a lot of times we see survivors come in this space and we look at them as less than, and survivors know it. And so they pick that up. And so how do we look at survivors from the strength and resiliency and the fight that they had to take every day to get to the space that they are, because their healing is worth it. And let's give them the platform and the opportunity to be able to do just that.
Amazing. Director Rose.
Well, I just want to echo what my fellow panelists have said. You know, probably the first thing I would wish for, and my colleagues know because of my frequent frustration in being able to ensure that the voices of survivors are heard when policy decisions are being made. I think I would make it so that every policymaker in the country understood at a very deep level how important those voices are in developing legislation, in developing promising practices, in creating programs, in making laws.
Mm-hmm.
Because without that, we aren't going to get to that place that we need to be. And so I think that webinars like this are really important because it helps to spread that message. And I can only hope that at some point survivors will always be at the table and we don't have to ask first.
That's amazing. I completely agree. I just want to thank everyone for being here today. I want to thank our amazing panel for sharing your expertise with us today. And honestly, thank all three of you. I want to thank all three of you for your leadership, your continued leadership. I know it's not easy, the fights that you fight, the challenges that you face. But your leadership, all three of you, is incredibly important in this space. Maria, to your point on the resources, I want to share briefly. Next month, our webinar will be on the resources issue. So we're going to talk about how do we get Congress to give Director Rose some more money so that she can get it out there into the field for some of those innovative programs? So what do we need to be advocating for with our legislators at the federal level and the state level? Because I think that some of the states are just not investing the way that they should. And so we're going to have that conversation next week. So we invite you all to join. But again, just a huge thank you to our three panelists for taking the time out of your day, sharing the expertise. And we are eternally grateful to you all for the work that you're doing. And thanks everyone for joining us. We hope to see you next month at our next webinar. Have a great afternoon, everyone.